All hail Abraxas Isis. Here we see the doubling curve, which is one of three factors to consider in our analysis of the apocalyptic times. In here we see the doubling phenomenon, which of course, generally summed up, is humanity from 10,500 BC in the flood period up until the time of Caesar Augustus in the Roman Empire creates one unit of human knowledge or human information. And the time it takes that unit to double is 1,500 years, to the time of Leonardo da Vinci, from Caesar to da Vinci. And then to double again, 1750 with Ben Franklin. Then the time it takes it to double again, 1900 with Arthur Conan Doyle. Doubles again in 1950 with Carl Jung. 1967 with Jim Morrison. 1973 with Robert Anton Wilson. Climaxing finally when the doubling past 73 gets to be so tight and so multi-dimensional. Climaxing in 2012 in the omega point. Now, as we know, at the same time, occurring simultaneously to this effect, is the time waves as we have articulated in our previous video. And the curious thing about the time waves is that we've already outlined the significance of the red time wave, which is going back to the reptilian era, etc., ending in 2012. The blue time wave, which is the Elven frequency, 1 million years ago to 2012. The green time wave is the dwarf/Atlantean frequency, and that covers the last two zodiacal ages of the clock, ending in the 2012 apocalyptic countdown as well. And that ties in another time scale, which we're of course always concerned with, which is the zodiacal ages, and how the time wave, which is green, encompasses specifically the age of Aries and the age of Pisces, ending in that period. And so creating a phenomenon now with the purple time wave of the 384 days ending in 2012. The fifth time wave, which I have not mentioned to this point, is one that runs from 1945 to 2012. And this is the white time wave. And this one divides like the equation 3 minus 1 plus 2 equals 4. The white timeline is like the equal sign that divides the three, which are the red, blue, and green influences on humanity, divides them, and above them and resolving them at the next pure time wave repeat is the purple frequency of the hyperhuman. And what this implies is that human history up until 1945 is a bizarre division between the three different time waves, creating various, resonance conflicts in humanity as these three forces, which we could personify as the imps, fairies, and gnomes, tug at us with their strings. And that led us to the point of 1945, which was when, with the atom bomb, with World War II and its implications, with all of the phenomena that was about the destruction utterly of history, the complete entry into an apocalyptic world where anything can happen and where we no longer know the rules, and where at Nuremberg we're redefining what the law is, what the rules are, what is the game. And so the way that this 1945 to 2012 white time wave functions is that it is drawing together and resolving the three previous time waves and resolving those elements, which is what, of course, in our old cosmic view, we had seen as the Three Stooges phenomenon that need to be balanced and synthesized into the Shemp. And that's the alchemical spin on the Stooges, which I have come up with in 1997 with my 3 minus 1 plus 2 equals 4. So if we look at the 5 time waves that are in play, and if we're thinking about the function of the 5th time wave, the white one, think of it in terms of that equation. the red time wave minus the green time wave plus the blue time wave equals the purple time wave. So that phenomenon now curiously intersects with the doubling, as I just said, because the doubling turns over again from 1900 to 1950. And this is the key period when all of the elements of world history are in collision. And it's also the period from 1945 onward when, because of the presence now of the white time wave, and how the white time wave is almost like a blank slate in that it's rewriting all of our perceptions of the red, blue, and green time waves. You see, our belief in certainty in any of the three time waves, red, blue, or green, ended with World War II and the atom bomb. Just like the end of all certainty about what was going to be the plan for humanity, the three contending time waves tugging at us, creating those different forces, the three different types of force that are tugging at us until finally the resolution point with the atom bomb and the ability to annihilate ourselves and the destruction of all of the threads of history, the burning of history that the Nazis initiate, creates the opportunity now with the white time wave for the rewriting of history to be undertaken. And this is also, curiously enough, with Nuremberg onward, the powers that be are saying that they're rewriting history. The guys at Nuremberg are saying we are recasting the code of humanity as far as what is going to be right and wrong, etc., etc. And everything that we're referring to now in terms of how the grid is playing out, the grid scenario, which is well known in many other videos, but briefly, is the manifestation of the Freemasonry conspiracy involving the U.S. presidencies, and more specifically the Hoover conspiracy, as we've seen it previously, contained within a grid within which these three forces are converging. The zodiacal countdown, the doubling, and the time wave. All three of those are converging in the grid. And so the grid itself is a method that the Masonic conspiracy has come up with for us to deal with the geopolitical and human cultural implications of these forces, the doubling, the time wave, the zodiacal countdown. And the zodiacal countdown, we must remember when I say that, I don't just mean ancient Babylonian zodiac, I'm also meaning the Mayan countdown, the Mayan calendar, the 2012, end of time, etc. And these forces are understood now in terms of a code, which is a mytho-symbolic code devised during the Enlightenment Freemasonry era and put in place by the Founding Fathers, and is, let's say, a blueprint for the emergence and the taking over by the United States specifically of all of history as it's ended. So you can look at the Founding Fathers as stepping up on the ship just as it's about to reach the conclusion of the mission. They're the guys who are going to be, defining the totality of the mission thus far. In other words, from the point of the Founding Fathers to the Apocalypse, we have the final rewrite of history, which is occurring, the final hour of the 26,000-year cycle, the final crunch of the doubling, which we must remember starts in 1750 with its crunch leading into 1900, which is going to occur midway through the grid. And then from 1900 to 1950, and how the 1950 doubling point is also the beginning point of the white time wave, how that then leads through the columns of the grid in a successive, let's say, tightening, a spiral tightening. So you can look at the journey that history is forced through. If you look at the grid here as a containment structure, the Masonic symbolism, the Masonic fraternity itself, all of the Enlightenment symbolism, all of the 1750 and onward, rejuvenation of the Greco-Roman democratic ideals and the Atlantis mythos, all of the theosophical digging up of the past, all of the stuff that like Albert Pike is pushing into American culture, all these things are part of the master plan to use the opportunity of America, the blank slate, the new Atlantis, to put together all the pieces of human history, and to do it in such a way that's going to take advantage of the time wave and the doubling. Now this is occurring, I'm describing it as if it's a conspiracy where a bunch of guys actually sat down and said, well, George Washington saying, well, this doubling is occurring, and this time wave is happening, and it's also going to converge with the Mayan calendar 220 years from now, so therefore we're going to design everything in a master plan. No, that's not what I'm saying. However, what I am saying is that the doubling is a natural phenomenon within the human brain, within the human version of the planetary brain. This doubling is describing the growth of the human brain cells, which is why it occurs. It starts, its first point is 10,500 BC, when we come out of the Ice Age, and then it goes to the Roman Empire, which is the first human New World Order, and then it goes from the Roman Empire to the Renaissance, which is the first idea of the human individual, becoming, through the fusion of alchemy, astrology, and the natural philosophies of the Enlightenment formula, becoming at the level that humans were at when the Atlanteans were on the scene, before it went wrong. The idea of the Renaissance man is kind of a reconstructed Atlantean man. If we're equating Atlantean man to be the potential firing on all cylinders version of what a brain cell should be. Da Vinci defines the Renaissance man, in terms of that, what's called the Vitruvian man, which is the guy inside the perfectly proportioned square and circle, right? And everybody sees that image, but hardly anyone ever stops to think of what it means or what Da Vinci is saying. What it actually that is, that's a puzzle that was posed by the ancient Greeks about the idea of the Platonic forms and shapes, a square and a circle in particular, being somehow the emblems of perfection that man must aspire to equal. And so how does man fit even visually? The theory is that as above, so below. The human body must visually fit into a perfectly balanced square and circle, and if it doesn't, then humanity can never attain that Atlantean perfection. So Da Vinci's way of doing it anyway, of placing the circle and square within each other, and then the human inside of that, was the answer. And so the idea is that the human mind, if it's balancing both the square and the circle, is going to be able to attain the let's say, Atlantean type of caliber, which is going to be required of humans in order to effectively be brain cells for the planet's purposes as the spiral is turning and as the doubling is occurring. You can look at, see, I summed it up perfectly the other day. The doubling is a function of the density of the planetary brain in terms of the humans. And when I say density, I mean the amount of information that brain is processing, okay? So it's a quantity issue, right? The time wave tells us what qualities that information is illuminating. Is it illuminating red, blue, green, or purple qualities, right? So quantity and quality. So understanding the doubling in terms of the brain, the human version of the planet brain undulating. Every time it doubles, it's like the brain fires in a certain amount of patterns. That pattern of firing is determined by the time waves, right? The quality of the firing. But the firing occurs in a certain way of aligning the brain's ability to take in perception and download information using the symbols to a certain point of what we would call an apotheosis, where everything fits and now we're on a whole other level. And that's the ascension to a new level, which is one of the doubling points. So that, curiously, the doubling phenomenon creates 7 plateaus of doubling before it reaches 1973, which is the point where it's occurring in terms of the presidential grid within more than one box, and it's occurring in a way where the way that the doubling of the brain relates to the grid is that the size of the brain in terms of this doubling phenomenon by 1750 is reaching its first big point, approaching what we would like consider to be adult consciousness for like a human brain. We're equating the growth of the planet brain as shown through the doubling with a human brain, right? It's getting to the point of adult consciousness, and so it's able to perceive itself in terms of a new world order, using the Roman model, because that was the first small-scale version of a new world order, which the Roman model, because it's the, I'm not going to get into too much detail about the specifics of the colors of the different doubling loops. We have here the idea that each of these doubling points is colored differently, right? The first one, the red one, is the Roman, ends with, Julius Caesar, it begins with Julius Caesar, it ends with Da Vinci. And, just as an example, that color is articulating what's happening during that doubling in terms of how the brain is changing. So, since, for example, that the red doubling loop goes from the Roman Empire to the Renaissance, it's articulating how the European culture, using that Greco-Roman formula, is attaining its first foundation, going from it. So the Greco-Roman world equates to the first one element or base for human brain cell functioning in terms of a human brain cell processing energy efficiently to one quantity of what's going to be required is equal to Caesar Augustus. And then that whole journey from Augustus to Da Vinci is that pattern of Augustus being repeated within the loop, repeated until it reaches an apotheosis and it becomes a Da Vinci level brain cell. Then that repeats and repeats and repeats until it bursts and becomes a Ben Franklin level. So each one can be seen as like it's a chrysalis level, and you're evolving almost in terms of the brain's capacity to process information. You're evolving almost from ape to man at every stage. And so the way that that intersects in the grid with the time wave is that all of the details involving the Founding Fathers' Freemasonry conspiracy and how it's articulated in my plot level with Joseph Smith and the Mormon Apocalypse and how things go wrong and the currents of the time wave as they're flowing through the grid, what we have to look at is when we say things go wrong, they start to repeat the wrong resonances from the grid. Joseph Smith makes the Faustian errors of the Edward Kellys or whatever of the world, etc., repeats, and they all end up repeating Atlantean mistakes, etc., falling for these wrong dips and curves of the waves because they're just, nobody's perfect in this scenario, and the fact is that the time wave is going to offer you the best and worst of every given point of history as it's resonating, right? And so early on in the grid, mistakes are made in the idea of repeating the mistakes of the Roman Empire, repeating the idea of how history begins to intensify and the nightmare begins to be repeated. And see, this is the point of World War I, and once we cross the 1900 doubling point, the amount of information isn't the issue anymore. It's about the way the information is being processed, and that is determined by the time wave. The way information is processed, the quality, in other words, at any given moment in this section of the grid from here to here until 1900, at any given moment, of course, the squiggle of the time wave is the same, and it's repeating at those three levels of red, blue, and green. So people alive who are on the cutting edge, let's say, of the consciousness, who are deciding the issues, who are making, the brain move, they're going to have to choose red, blue, or green in terms of which resonance they're going to be strengthening, which chords. Are they listening to imps, fairies, or gnomes is what it comes down to. But the trick is, in the same way that McKenna warns us that fashion and hemlines are rising and falling in accordance with the rise and fall of empires, okay? Trends and, you see, the collective consciousness is really coming into shape here as the grid develops as well, you see. And, 1900 is the tipping point for global consciousness, right? But, it's interesting in terms of the plot level aspects of the grid. If we're filling in the grid, not in terms of characters and people alive, but in terms of technologies, in terms of what technologies are developed when, right? And how the doubling and doubling of information, if you're looking at the doubling phenomenon within the grid for different contexts, one way to very clearly follow the doubling pattern within the grid is to look at technological developments and when certain things were invented and how the amount of information available forced the hand of invention, and then how invention forced political, social, religious implications according to a red, blue, green resonance. And this is the type of exploration I haven't even done yet because I haven't even fully understood the time wave until I'm even talking about it now in these videos. So, my point is that the 1900 doubling point is the moment when, midway through the grid, okay, all this content that is in the history of the United States, what's happening with Joseph Smith and the Mormons, what happens as a result of Andrew Jackson. See, it's not just, I haven't talked about this in great detail, it's not just Joseph Smith that goes wrong, it's Andrew Jackson, Mr. Big Block of Cheese, goes off grid with his plan and his turning against the Native American Indians and how the Indians were supposed to be helping us from purple to build our New World Order at red and turn this into a red column so that we end at blue by the era of the apocalypse. So that would have been an entirely different world and a much happier scenario. But unfortunately, Andrew Jackson decided to kill them all. And so that was decided at the same time that Smith went off message with the polygamy. And so that's why we ended up in this incorrect blue column, right? And things went awry, etc. And the repeating of Atlantean mistakes reached the escalation level in the Civil War era. And now we're understanding this more if we're looking at the resonance of the time waves, okay? Remembering when Atlantis and these eras actually did occur in terms of the zodiac timetable 19,000 years ago. Well, at that time, both red and blue time waves were running. The blue time wave charts the development of the Atlantis civilization during that period. The red time wave charts the downfall from the moment that Lemuria digs up the Velociraptor until, the destruction of things. So, the Atlantis-Lemuria division is reflected in the North and South in the Civil War. Shockingly. And there's an entire way of overlaying the American Civil War with the Atlantis-Lemuria Civil War. And this isn't just because it happens to coincide with that point in the grid, but it's also now we know because the time wave, as defined by McKenna, makes that inevitable support for that conclusion due to the fact that both Atlantis and Lemuria were occurring at different points when the time wave resonance will prove out the whole, the overlay fractally of the time wave because of the way, you're repeating the different events at the resonance points, etc., etc. So that phenomenon converges with the doubling point at the 1900 doubling, right? And so the period from 1900 through to 1950, when we're going to be ending history, let's say, that information, every time that the loop repeats, every time that the doubling loop repeats, it says it's the doubling of information. But it's not just that, it's the doubling of specific types of information. And we have to look at it as the 7 different doubling curves from 10,500 BC to 1973 are conveying to us 7 different types of information, which we would have to equate with the different rows of the chart, obviously, but more importantly with the 7 watchers, or the 7 planetary overlords, or planetary influences, which is what we have in the reverse apocalypse in the apocalypse plates. So, I guess what I'm secretly revealing here is I'm going to be, wrapping it up soon, inevitably. Okay. What I'm revealing is that our reverse apocalypse plates, the 7 planetary spheres that we're using, we now can slip the 7 doubling periods into the 7 planetary spheres. And those 7 doubling periods are covering the way that information has reached its critical mass point in 1973. And I just have to add that I'm slightly disturbed at the coincidence of the Hoover plot, as dictated to us in the old Cosmic, and that 1973 point. It's a bit disturbing, especially given the presence of Nixon in the key red box at the bottom of this column, and that's when those events are all occurring. And so, not that I'm not, there's no negative conspiratorial spin with the presidential grid, for one thing. Because they're all working for the goddess forces of the dead, ultimately. Everything's being put in place across 220 years, according to a mistress plan, that no one person is ever in charge of. The symbolism itself, in a weird way, is in charge of the DC mechanism. And that, I have to say, in summary regarding the grid, that phenomenon of nobody being in charge is one of the weird things that's comforting about it, and that's the way it was set up by the Founding Fathers. They were viewing Providence, the all-powerful force of Providence, as a kind of natural game gravity. The G would, if you just, in the same way, like, it's part of the whole ethic of the time, the wealth of nations, Adam Smith, right? The idea of the invisible hand that organizes the city, organizes human society. This whole idea of the invisible hand of Providence, the theory was all we have to do is align and arrange the grid of Washington, D.C. to be the brain of the nation, but also by default the planet, the New World Order. And by a weird symbolic gravity, just by ensuring in the laws, in the Constitution, that people are free, and that there is no authority, and that there is no plan, and that there's no limits on what the potentiality can do, right? By setting up those conditions and just putting the machine running, right? The Masonic symbolism and its ability to assimilate, it begins to work all on its own, and the machine itself runs pretty well, smoothly on its own, up until the point where it produces, at the top of the first column, it produces characters who are, let's say, born from the machine, right? If you want to look at this grid as the matrix, okay, in terms of the matrix type of plots, it's also a machine constructed by the Founding Fathers, and we got to remember that on the Great Seal of the United States, the Founding Fathers put the pyramid, which is the Chapel Perilous pyramid of all of human history. And on top of that pyramid is the unfinished, truncated platform, and the grid of the presidents rests on top of that platform. And that grid is the 220-year period from their time at the start, 1789, to the end, 2009, our time in the apocalypse. And so every space on the grid is controlling one area of human history. All the history prior to 1776, right, is contained somewhere in the different plot level considerations that are laid out in the grid. And this is all according to the plot level of characters at the beginning. The Founding Fathers, Catherine the Great, Saint Germain, and these characters. All of this is being arranged by the Ascended Masters and the Planetary Angels, which is again Sam Geza and the crew. They're not saying, no one ever says, oh, we're going to put together a grid. But they do come up with the truncated pyramid symbolism. And they do create the presidency, and they do set conditions and scenarios that, with a minimal amount of participation from their successors, would allow a structure. And that, you see, this grid appears in Freemasonry as the tessellated pavement that is at the center of the lodge. And it has the black and white squares, just like the chessboard type of approach. And in Freemasonry, the grid is the design board upon which Hiram Abiff, or whoever the master is, draws his designs. He draws his designs upon the trestle board for the craft to pursue their labor, right? So the design being drawn is being drawn by the hand of Providence. And that design has a few elements. In the background constantly is this time wave element into the design. In the foreground is the planetary brain, and the size and ferocity of that brain is determined by the doubling phenomenon. And the different segments of this process as we're viewing the unfolding of this organism takes the form of the grid. The unfolding of the history across the grid is a process, a 220-year process, by which the dead make sense of history and put to bed all lingering plot levels of the human equation. And through the Freemasonry symbolism, which has the ability, through its basic architectural generalities, to assimilate all cosmic systems, it provides a tool by which those who are on the grid, which is the apocalyptic characters, because it's all under the premise that the grid ends with the apocalypse, post the year 2000. So the apocalyptic characters are by definition the 144,000 of the apocalypse, who are above it all, the raptured ones, who are the chosen. They're going to be puppeteering all the events below during the apocalypse, i.e. controlling through the grid, controlling the boxes in the cubes in the pyramid below them. And inside that pyramid is the Chapel Perilous, which contains all the elements of plot level, which are now seething with participants in the collective consciousness due to the doubling, right? So the whole process of the doubling with the time waves creates a heating up of the grid and a bursting with dreams of power at the end, which we could say melts the whole system. And it's almost like in Pi, the system, the computer, becomes self-aware when it melts its own circuitry through its repeating of the spiral. It repeats its analysis of the golden mean, the spiral, enough times till it heats up and overloads. And then when that moment of overload, that's when the aha occurs. 2009 is when that's supposed to occur for Columbia, which is the symbolic figure that the Founding Fathers gave us to stand in for the New World Order as a personified being, which is the spirit of America in the general iconography, Lady Liberty, but is also the Star Child, or standing in for the hyperhuman per se. So, as the grid is the resolution of human history, it is also the drawing of the personality profile for Columbia. It is also the resolution of the doubling time wave convergence. It is also the symbolic meta-system that eats all other human symbol systems, with the exception of the I Ching. That's the one exception. The one thing that the grid does not eat is the I Ching, now that I think of it. Okay? And that's why the grid ending in 2009, the 22 shapes go around the grid in an arch like this, and they represent the door, the archway of the door that we're going through, the ninth gate type going through in 2009 here. We go through that door. And so as we go through that door, we're handed a toolbox containing the 22 shapes. And then everything from 2009 to 2012 is a non-linear post, or not even post-apocalyptic, but apocalyptic transitional membrane, let's say, a quiff in popping from 9 to 12, wherein we're using these shapes simultaneously to communicate with the other, that's the transcendental object and its occupants, which are the dwarves and whoever else is coming our way, 2010 to 12, to prep us for our hyperness or not. So the grid's function is to get us ready for the point in 2009 where we have to be ready for the contact in 2010, which is going to determine how we're going to define our omega point as it's occurring in 2012. So everyone alive from January 20th onward is standing on the grid by definition. All right? Whether or not you instantly fall into one of the boxes through a plot level addiction of some kind, fall into one of the boxes, that means that you're checked out and you're into the million pyramid. And that means that you're now exemplifying, through example, a certain plot level, which is on a menu in Chapel Perilous for the billions of humanity who are coming up the mound to get into the pyramid. Right? And so in 2009, in any event, it then becomes a contendership for who's got the best definition of 2012 that bridges where the grid left us with where the omega point promises to take us. The answer, therefore, is a 64-based situation which is going to assimilate the grid. Since the grid, by 2009, will have assimilated everything in human history, all we have to do is wait for that process to occur and then scoop the grid itself. Thank you very much. Done. Right? Human history, done. Quest for fire, over. Right? Okay? And it's all good. And then we have the shapes to represent the 22 elements of our new alphabet. And that alphabet is specifically designed for the expression of hyperhumanity and its own ability now with all 5 time waves happening towards 2012 to use the shapes in a responsible way, because just as those 5 time waves, think of the shapes as the red, blue, and green time wave, all the peaks and valleys, etc., have been translated now into the shapes. Okay? And through the same process, the peaks and valleys of the 384-day cycle have been translated into the purple shapes. And the purple shapes apply to hyperhumanity in our goal of achieving Columbia's apotheosis, which is, again, what the grid is supposed to be preparing us to do, blah, blah, blah. So the hyperhumanity is expressed by a 5-dimensional human being, which is what all of the architecture of the shapes is supposed to do, happens to correspond to the major arcana of the tarot and the journey of the fool to enlightenment at Judgment Day. So, as I have my final minutes here with this video, which is the final minutes of my whole spiel on everything, what I have to say is the Nazis were trying to control the white time wave. That's why their timetable ended in 1945. And had they won, they could have redefined. You see, the United States won World War II along with Russia. And the United States and Russia got to define the white time wave as a result. All right? The Russia definition of the white time wave is strictly controlled by a dwarf agenda and a Peter the Great set of protocols that everybody from Lenin to Vlad Putin has been slaved to. Bottom line, and I can prove that all day long and twice on Saturday. All right? The United States definition of the white time wave is a more complex affair regulated by Freemasonry and the presidential grid, and how the Columbia figure is being used as the sojourner through all the maze of human history and symbology. And from 1945 to 2012, the main concern of the white time wave, the main concern of the United States and Russia is what? The UFO, which is the approaching confrontation with contact and the global ramifications of the end of history and how it's going to pull. You see, history is the only thing, this is the final point I must make, history is the only thing keeping the curtain up between us and the dwarves. History, the human matrix as it's running, is the only thing that is allowing the blinders to still be on hyperspatially. That cocoon ends per force when the grid ends, January 20th, 2009. From that period onward, it's almost the effects of the matrix will still be present due to momentum and the crack-addicted billions. But the point is that there'll be no more reinforcement, because the reason for that corresponds to the fact that in both the doubling, and in the time wave crunch, the novelty increase will be at such a rate by 2009, and this is mathematically proven by the doubling, for example, that there's no possible way to hold on to any notions of what the world's going to be like. And that is the death of the matrix. And in that scenario, when we're going to be reevaluating the very nature of humanity and our ability to perceive anything, that's when more and more people are going to start to see, behind the prop sets of the mundane world, let's say, and the dwarves are going to be more and more evident. So that's why by 2010, it's the year we make contact, you see, where the contact is merely that the effect of the curtain has melted away to the point where we're now seeing what's been happening all along. All right? So the UFO question from 1945 to 2012, of course, is a major facet of the white time wave, because the white time wave is just the blast in your face of the raw hyper border between what was Atlantean, Elven dinosaur and what will be the hyperhuman or the real human. From this point, I'm not even comfortable using the term human to describe that 384-day cycle, because it must be the hyperhumans. And this is what is meant by the calendar of light predicted number of the 6,012 characters from the 144,000 of the apocalyptic vanguard. Out of them, according to the Mayan calendar's intersection with the calendar of light and the grid's numerology, you end up with 6,012 people from the 144,000 who will be in the position to define how the final rebooting is going to occur. And so all I know for certain is that I'm already there at that point pulling the trigger. Okay? And I would say that by our collaboration on the hyperplates, we're agreeing that we'll be there together pulling our separate triggers in concordance with some kind of objective relating to the transcendental object. That's a solid prediction and a good note on which to end this re-imprinting video. Right? Manu!